Thank you, Mr. President. Now, I've learned throughout my, 6 years working with the media and discussing gender representation and diversity that saying what you think people want you to hear isn't going to make them respect you, or you're not going to win an argument. It's not going to allow people to see who you really are, and in fact, it will do quite the opposite. When I sat down to write this argument, knowing that I was going to be speaking here, specifically at the Oxford Union, I felt that feeling rise again. That slight feeling that I should maybe speak or look or act in a certain way that was going to win your favour, to think that you'd already decided on your argument before seeing me speak. I thought this is no place for anecdotes or wry humour, but clearly I was wrong. But in my experience, speaking to people about what gender looks like and feels like can only really be done through sharing a lived experience, for they are the only thing that connect us through the body and the mind. The affinity to say, I think I've felt that too, despite our vast differences. Now, I don't want to focus too heavily on differences. Yes, there is a glaring one right now, but it's not my fault that the proposition didn't decide to dress better than the opposition, or just me, in fact, although I am quite jealous of the previous speaker's tie. Thank you. But let's be real and look at this argument itself. To take this argument apart, I want to really visualize what post-genderism might look like. Now, it's a phrase and word that is often attributed to trans people rather than one that is claimed by them. I don't say those words out of my mouth, yet people presume that I would. As a non-binary person myself, often when I share that with people for the first time, they expect me to desire a world that is post-gender. There is an expectation that I'm almost flippant or nonchalant about gender. An assumption that by identifying outside of the gender binary means that I and every other person on this planet must think that way, or that if I see boys wearing blue and girls wearing pink, that I will suddenly come out in hives. A picture has been painted, yes, of unethical debates across the media that trans and non-binary people are like gender cybermen, wanting to recruit fellow cisgender people into their ranks. One tap on the shoulder and suddenly any notion of the gender binary will disappear. But nowadays, I don't see it like that at all. Identifying outside of the gender binary for me doesn't mean that I am existing outside of gender itself. It just means that the social construction of what it means to be a man or a woman doesn't quite fit me. This idea that trans people desire complete removal of gender from society is an illusory tale that many right-wing politicians and commentators use to sink cisgender people who don't believe that trans people exist deeper into their own prejudices. A tool used again to paint a picture of a very specific picture that transness is an illness, a curse that spreads through society, eradicating anything that is gendered, rendering it obsolete, rather than a beautiful expression of self, which it can be. Again, if we were to really visualize what a world might look like if it was post-gender, what would happen to the people who are happy with the gender identity that they subscribe to? Do we serve them a very polite eviction notice, asking them to leave the place as they found it with a deep clean and move into this chic loft insulation called post-genderism, which I think would be foolish? The proposition will say that a post-gender society will allow people of all genders to be free and exist in a way that doesn't have parameters or boundaries, and I understand that sentiment entirely. But to be able to be free in oneself doesn't mean that one must therefore remove the social construction entirely. Destruction and removal of gender in society doesn't mean that suddenly everybody will then be treated equally, as my speakers have discussed. Now let's take a look at masculinity, for example. In 1994, Roger Horrocks was one of the first psychotherapists in America to talk of a crisis of men in masculinity in Western culture. This later became commonly discussed as the crisis in masculinity, where he described that the simple paradox that men feel are that they are broken by their own privileged position of power, which advocates domination, a rejection of the feminine and homosexual, and the denial of all vulnerabilities and weaknesses. Now, fast forward 29 years, and we're here in the present day, and conversations around masculinity in the Western world specifically are vast and arguably saturated. But one thing that these conversations have in common is that they all include men in them. What is important to note is that they're not voyeuristic. Men who identify as men, wanting to reconstruct their own ideas of what it means to be a man, have not had to have their gender identity destroyed to then be able to reconstruct that notion. Working from within, the role of gender in this situation is important because it allows people who identify as men to shape and curate their own way of being so. Throughout all of this, gender has remained intact, but its walls have moved, allowing a freedom and fluidity that the proposition would argue couldn't exist without gender's walls having to be teared down. In my own personal experience of understanding my own gender identity, I remember the unfiltered joy of beginning to find out who I was. And that wasn't through watching Tintin and thinking, what could I do slightly differently here? To find out what my expression of self could look like if I allowed those parameters of gender to just slightly widen, to see that there was space for the gender that I subscribe to, despite not knowing the language yet. If you speak to most trans people, the solitary moments of gender euphoria are often the best moments of their lives. Now, yes, mine was filled with fear at first, of course, hiding my femininity and secretly purchasing clothes and makeup under my duvet, seeing how it would make me feel, waiting for that affirming moment. Now, the proposition would say, well, Jamie, if we lived in a post-gender world, you wouldn't need to be scared. But what they failed to realize is that I wasn't scared, not completely. I was tentative, yes, but I was excited. I was cautiously exploring what gender itself looked like outside of male and female. I wasn't saying goodbye to it, or I wasn't wanting to get rid of it. I was merely hiding a version and finding a version of it that was Jamie-sized. I was beginning to give myself permission to widen the parameters of what gender could look like. And arguably, without the gender binary, I would never have been able to understand that I was personally non-binary. If it weren't for the seemingly concrete definitions of male and female, I may never have been able to spout up through the concrete outside of the two. We can use traditional depictions of gender as a springboard to explore its many facets, allowing everybody to then curate their own unique depiction of what it means to be the gender they identify with. Just because you identify as a woman, for example, doesn't mean that you need to be feminine or exist in a submissive role within society. The rest is for you to decide how that feels, how that looks, and what it means to you to be a woman. And equally, just because you identify as a man doesn't mean that, you have bad taste in fashion, or think Comedy Central is a channel that is still worth watching, or need to buy your partner silver charms from Pandora every single Christmas. What I am saying, though, is no matter what gender you identify with, the only person that has the ability to push those parameters just a little wider is you. Gender acts as a grounding point for many to find community and connection, to feel safe, to feel warm, and to share the same lived experience as others, as well as learn from those who differ. I applaud the intellect and commonalities that we all share here today. From the age of 13 up until now standing here before you, I've always had the doubt that being trans or being queer has meant that I will never be able to feel like I am the same as the rest of the world. That this difference is too big, so big that it gets in the way of being loved. But by befriending gender and remembering the permission that I granted myself all those years ago to allow the parameters of gender to move and flow as I moved with it, means that I will always be grateful for the role that gender has played in society and in my life. Without it, I wouldn't be able to connect, learn, and love those around me. Without understanding my own gender identity, I would never have come to the realization that difference is something to be adored and uplifted. Without gender, I would never have come to the realization that difference doesn't negate unconditional love, it fosters it. Thank you.